Hello everyone, welcome to Simple Rules for an Effective Research Presentation. The goal of this workshop is to help you design and deliver an oral presentation that effectively communicates your research. But you'll find that many of the suggestions provided here could also be applied to any oral presentation and not just research presentations. So here's an outline of what will be covered in this session. First, I'm going to talk about what makes an effective presentation. Then I'm going to show you how to organize the content of your presentation. Next, how to design your slides in order to keep your audience focused on your talk. And then lastly, tips for delivering your presentation orally. So let's begin with number one. What makes an effective presentation? Two things mark an effective presentation. One, the audience is able to follow along. And two, they're able to understand your central message and then remember it after you've finished your presentation. You need the audience to follow along in order to convince them of your methodology and your conclusions. That's one of the purposes of presenting at conferences. Presentation slides can help you in this regard if you design your slides for your audience and not for your own convenience. In other words, not using your slides as your notes. The goal in organizing and designing your presentation is to minimize the amount of mental work that your audience has to do. So this will require you to have an organized structure and visual clarity. The clearer the overall picture of your work, the better your presentation will be judged. So before you even begin planning your presentation, take a moment to ask yourself, who is my audience? Is it a specialized audience, people from your field, or is it a general audience, people from outside your field? For the undergraduate research conference at Purdue, you are presenting to a general audience. Even if the judges are from your disciplinary college, other people will be viewing your presentation from outside of your college. So you need to design your presentation for everyone. Try avoiding technical terms if you can, or define them using accessible language. Also, for those who are in STEM, you'll want to avoid using formulas. Here's a structure commonly used for research presentations. It's organized in such a way that it tells a story. So you'll start with a title slide, then provide the motivation behind your study, behind your project, also known as the background section. You'll then have your research question slide, followed by your methods and results. So if you have multiple components to your project or multiple experiments, then you'll want to have a method slide for each of those components. So methods and then results, methods, results, methods, results. You don't want to put all of the methods in one section. Following the results section, you'll want a conclusion slide, then a future direction slide, acknowledgements, and then references. Usually the future directions and acknowledgements are shown if you have enough time at the end, and the reference to the slide is just there in case someone asks you a question after your presentation, but it's typically not shown, but you'll want to have it. All right, so let's start with the title slide. So the title slide should include the title of your talk, the speaker's name, college affiliation. So if you are affiliated with more than one college, you want to include both of those colleges. And then it's not required, but many people include their email address in case people in the audience want to contact the person to follow up, to ask follow-up questions, but it's not required. This is the slide that will be displayed while you're waiting to be introduced. Now, in the case of a virtual conference, this will not be just sitting there, but for a live conference, it's really an opportunity to tap into the visual part of the audience's brain by using some sort of image on the title slide that suggests the content of your talk. So as you can see, the examples shown on the right are a bit more memorable than the examples shown on the left, but you could still have a great talk without having a spiffy title slide. It's not essential, but it's a great way to engage your audience right from the start and make your presentation more memorable. All right, next comes the motivation, or also known as the background section of your presentation. This is a very, very important part of your talk. This is where you hook in your audience by setting up the context of your study and its purpose. So before telling them what your research is about, You want to tell them the motivation behind your research, the motivation behind your research question. What is the problem that you tried to address? Why is it important to solve this problem in the big picture of things? What was already known about your study? So what was already known about this topic that you addressed in your study? The goal here is to give the audience a minimal amount of background information on your problem or on your topic in order to understand what led you to come up with your research question. And in order to do this, you'll need to briefly summarize some past studies from published literature. And make sure you include in-text citations when referring to past studies. And then finally, you'll want to end with what is the gap in knowledge that still needed investigation that you are planning to address? When you are explaining the motivation or what's already known about your topic, try to use schematics as much as possible instead of text, because research shows that people learn better from words and pictures together rather than words alone. So for example, here I have a schematic on the right of a signaling pathway in the cell. The reason why I'm using biology examples is because my background's in biology, so that's the reason for that. What I'm doing here is I'm showing, instead of writing out, the relationship between these two molecules in the aging process. Now, you might not have time or you might not even need to create schematics from scratch. You can search Google Images to find figures in published papers. Just make sure that you give credit to the source of your images. Make sure you provide an in-text citation showing where you got that image from or that figure from. You can also supplement the figure with text, summarizing the key points that you want your audience to take away from that figure in order to understand your upcoming research question slide. Now, if the figures that you find online on Google Images has way more detail and complexity than you plan to cover, then make your own figure using PowerPoint and Keynote. Don't ever include material that you don't plan to discuss in your presentation. So here are two examples that you would want to avoid. Here's a schematic that I created for a class in which I wanted to explain a biological mechanism to a general audience. So these were students who were non-bio majors. You want to avoid technical terms where you can, or if you do use technical terms, be sure that you define them beforehand or as you're explaining the schematic. Next comes your research question slide, probably the most important slide of your presentation. Dedicate a single slide to your research question and actually write out your research question. Research shows that the audience pays maximum attention at the beginning of a talk and at the end of the talk. So I suggest to, after you state your research question, also verbally state your overall conclusion at the end of this slide. In other words, answer your research question. So that your audience knows where you're heading, where you're going to go with your results. By giving them this preview, it will make it easier for them to follow along and see how all the pieces will ultimately fit together at the end. Next comes the methods. The goal here is to explain what methods you used and why you used them. How will those methods address your research question? So, for example, if you use an animal model, why did you use that animal model? What was the advantage of that animal model over others? If you surveyed a particular demographic population of people, what were those variables? Why those specific demographics were chosen? You should mention that. If you have done several experiments, as I mentioned, you'll want to introduce the methods for each of those experiments or each of the components of that project separately. So again, experiment number 1, here's my methods, here are my results. Here's experiment number 2, methods, results, so on and so forth. Try to use visuals where you can again. So especially if you are trying to show the audience an overall experimental design, schematics are really useful for that. Now the results section. Don't cram all of your experiments and results into one slide. It makes it difficult to follow along. It's also difficult to see, especially for people who are in the back of the room. One result per slide is sort of the sweet spot. You're not being judged on the amount of data you have. You're being judged on the quality of your presentation. So if you don't have enough time to include everything, that's fine. Take out some of the experiments and just focus on the most important ones, the big ones. When discussing your results, orient the audience first by defining the variables shown in your figures. So don't just jump right in and say what your finding was. First, orient the audience. So for example, if you're showing a graph, what are you measuring? Who are you or what are you measuring it in? Define the X and Y axis first. What do the black bars represent versus the white bars? Then tell the audience your result, your finding. If you're using a picture or an image, what are we looking at? What kind of cell is that? What does the blue represent? What does the red represent? And then tell them your result. If you collaborated with others on a project, and most researchers do collaborate and work in teams, you can present their work as part of your story, but you must give credit to them on your slide. Researchers present data from collaborators all the time. It does not diminish the value of your work at all. It's in fact unethical to present data as your own if you did not do the work yourself. And you may get caught in the Q&A if someone in the audience asks a question about a particular experiment or a particular slide, and you can't answer that question because you didn't do that experiment. When writing the headlines for your results slides, try to use concise, active, Twitter-like headlines. You can often get the gist of what an article is about just by reading the headlines on Twitter. So ask yourself, what is the most important finding that I want the audience to remember from this part of my project or this particular experiment? You can then provide context to that headline in the bullet points that follow on that slide. So compare the example on the left, which is a passive headline, versus the example on the right, which is an active headline. Next is your conclusion slide. Dedicate one slide to the conclusion. It should answer your research question. What is your central message? Write it out. Then you can verbally expand on the importance of your conclusions. So what was the gap in knowledge that you filled? Why is this important to the field or to the overall problem? Did you make food safer? Did you make manufacturing more efficient? Do your results contribute to making traveling safer? So on and so forth. Future directions. Again, if you have time, discuss the future directions. Have the slide there as in case you do have extra time. So future directions basically should address what would someone do if they were to continue your project? What are the remaining questions that would need to be addressed? You'll want a slide. You'll want a slide that acknowledges all those who helped you with your research experience. So starting with your principal investigator, that's your faculty mentor. You'll want to include the graduate student or the postdoc that trained you and mentored you as well as any collaborators, so any lab mates that worked on this project with you. You'll also want to acknowledge your funding sources. So if you got a grant or an undergraduate research grant or an undergraduate research scholarship, you would want to include that on your acknowledgement slide as well. So have the slide there. If you don't run out of time, make sure you show that slide. And then lastly, you'll want to have a references slide. This will not be shown, but you'll want it as a backup in case someone asks you a question after your presentation and you need to refer back to your references. References should not be bulleted. That's a common mistake that I've seen in the past. All right, moving on to the design of your slides. So some of these I've sort of touched upon already. Simple rules for designing your slides. Number one, don't use your slides as a crutch to remember what to say. Too much text makes it very difficult for your audience to follow along. And so rather than listening to you, they are trying to read your slides. And so they will lose focus. So compare these two slides again. I've used these examples previously. So which slide is more easy to follow and more memorable? You'll notice that the one on the right uses full sentences, whereas the one on the left only includes words that the audience needs in order to follow along. You can then expand on each bullet verbally. So you don't need to write everything that you want to say on the slide. It's a good idea also to bold keywords or highlight them for special emphasis. Second, reduce unnecessary blank space. So here's an example from a student presentation years ago, and you can see that this slide has a lot of blank space. Take advantage of that blank space to make it easier for your audience to read. This slide can be improved by reducing the amount of blank space by increasing the text size and the spacing, and or using an image. Number 3, break down complex slides into simpler, cleaner ones. So for example, this slide here is very cluttered and disorganized. Instead of packing all of this information into one slide, this can be broken down into 2 or 3 simpler slides using the same headline. Text, generally, you want to stay above 24, so keep it large and simple. And avoid anything below text size 24. So again, try to increase the font size so that you're maximizing the usage of your blank space. Lastly, oral delivery. So the key to a good oral presentation is confidence. This comes by knowing your material and practicing, practicing, practicing. I don't recommend memorizing your presentation because if you forget to say something or if you reword something that you didn't memorize prior to your presentation, you might panic and blank out in the middle of your presentation. So instead of memorizing or reading, you can use the presenter notes function of your PowerPoint or Keynote and just glance off of it, once in a while just to remember what your next point is. But I don't recommend memorizing other than maybe your opening and your closing. The reason why you want to avoid reading is because when you read, your voice becomes monotone, the speaking pace becomes very fast, you lose eye contact with your audience, and you interact less with your slides. And the net result is a less engaging speaker. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions about making presentations, feel free to post them in the comments section.